Hi, good Vach. At least by the time you see this, hopefully it's Motzi Shabbos, 8 o'clock. We're doing this as Corona has dictated during the week, recording this. You are listening to the 2020-2021 lecture series, sponsored by the Lehman family. I want to thank the Lehmans for being the series sponsor. And as always, and I want to thank tonight's sponsor, as you can see, it's the Rechthands, in memory of Esther's mom, Lisa Hamermesh, Liba Betzalel, Shalom Aliyah. Thank them. We are now going to, the name of the series is Roller Coaster, the State of Israel and Jewish People in the mid-1980s. Tonight is the sixth lecture entitled Reagan Without Begin, the USA and the State of Israel in the mid-1980s, part one. Scheduled two parts for this. Before I proceed, I want to thank, as always, not only our sponsors, but our tech team. My son over here, Yudaleb, is running the whole operation, and really is the one making this happen for you. I want to thank Howard Elbaum for putting together the PowerPoint, as he does so efficiently every week. And I want to thank specifically Yossi Westing, who's going to be editing this for your pleasure and convenience. And now, without any further ado, I'll get to the body of my remarks. As I said, we're dealing now with the sixth lecture. However, I didn't finish last week everything. It was too much to pack in at one time. And so I'm going to try to begin my talk tonight by finishing my rather long description of the agony and the rescue of the Ethiopian Jews, or at least some of them, in the mid-1980s, with the final act that took place during that decade, at the beginning of Ronald Reagan's second administration, which of course began on January 20th, 1985. As we saw last week, Israel had worked out a secret deal whereby 6,000 to 9,000 of these Ethiopian Jews who were stuck in these refugee camps in Sudan, I hope you remember that. Nobody really knew the exact number. I mean, how could you know the exact number? But hopefully they would be driven in trucks from the refugee camps straight to the national airport at the capital city of Khartoum, about 255 miles. Let's take a look at the first slide. So there you see what it says, El Gadarif is where the refugee camps are located. If you look on the right side, you'll see the destiny of Khartoum. So it's all across a big country. I mean, you don't know this, but Sudan, before it broke into two parts, back in those days, was as big as the eastern part of the United States. Do you understand what I'm saying? You wouldn't think so. Sudan is as big as America east of the Mississippi River. That's pretty big. And so these Jews, if they had a couple hundred miles, to use American terminology, they'd be located in Georgia, and they had to be transported, I don't know, to Ohio, somewhere like that, Illinois. It was a drive. So anyway, they would be flown, according to the deal that we spoke about last week, to Khartoum, to the airport. They unload from the trucks at the airport. They put them on these Belgian airliners, that Belgian operation I spoke about last week. And then the Belgians fly them to Brussels, and then of course they go right to Israel. This was the system that I described. Now, this operation, as I described, continued relatively unobtrusively for about 60 days. Remember, the public doesn't see anything. You just put these guys in trucks, you drive them across the country, you take them straight to an airport. They're on the side. It's all been, the fix is in, and then they're gone. But I also pointed out that rumors began from day one, and the rumors eventually exploded on the front page of the international media, which led to the sudden shutdown of the whole operation by the Sudanese government. This was sad to say the least, because over 90% of the Ethiopian Jews located in the refugee camps had been flown out. If it would just be another couple days, it would have been a clean sweep. But now that last 10% were stranded and really were screwed because the situation was just frustrating. I said the last 10%. I don't know how many. This was a guess. Nobody knew the exact number, but everybody estimated several thousand. I want to remind you, assuming that you've been following this story, the great majority of the Ethiopian Jews were stuck back in Ethiopia, and there was nothing you could do to help them because Israel didn't have relations with them, America didn't have relations with them. It was a mess. Now the story has an interesting turn. By this time, which will be January of '85, the cause of Ethiopian Jewry that I've been describing had penetrated the consciousness of activist American Jews. I'm talking about the types of Jews who are Jewish Jews. They get involved in Jewish causes like Israel, Soviet Jewry. This was a different America I'm describing. This was the Ronald Reagan era, before BDS. It was, if I can use the term, the golden age of AIPAC. It was a different time. A couple of wealthy Jewish activists in Los Angeles read the bad news in the media, and they were loaded. They determined they're going to do something about it. They contacted their senator in Washington, Alan Cranston, senator from California. Some of us may remember him. He was a minority whip. At that time, the Republicans controlled the Congress. So you have the majority minority, and Democrats a minority. There's the number one spot is what you call minority leader, and the number two spot is called the whip. Okay, so Alan Cranston was high up in the hierarchy. Here, I'll throw you out a trivia question. I bet you nobody knows this, but don't cheat and don't look at don't look it up. Today, right now, who's the minority leader in the U.S. Senate? Well, you'll tell me, well, of course, everybody knows it's Schumer. Okay, who's the whip? Bet you don't know. You failed your civics test. Anyhow, so Alan Cranston was Democratic senator from California, powerful guy. And one of the callers who called Cranston was this wealthy Jewish guy who was involved in, what shall I say, in politics, political causes. He wasn't Sheldon Adelson, but he's a precursor of Sheldon Adelson, because he took down Charles Percy. I don't know if you remember this from yesteryear. Let's go to the next slide. There's Cranston, as you see. Used to be Senator Percy, who was the Republican of Illinois, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and pretty unfriendly to Israel. And this guy bankrolled the guy who ran against him and beat him. And so these are politically active guys. Meanwhile, in New York City, another Jewish activist independently contacts his Republican senator, Alphonse D'Amato. If you remember him later on, some people remember him fondly, some people do not. And each of these guys spring into action, Cranston on one hand and D'Amato on the other, and they each circulate a secret petition, which they get signed by 100 senators. That doesn't happen. Okay? They got every member of the United States Senate without exception to sign and keep their mouth shut, that they could take to Ronald Reagan and there's a petition to say like this: help the last 10% of the Ethiopian Jews stuck in the refugee camps in Sudan, get them out there. Help. The USA should help. Reagan was willing, he indicated he was willing, but what do? Now, as it happens, Vice President George Bush is about to go to Sudan on a long planned trip to discuss Cold War issues, foreign aid, and things of that nature. George Bush, at that time Vice President, had previously been director of the CIA. See, he was used to secret negotiations, and he was willing to help when he meets with the Sudanese dictator, Numeri. Okay? And here we have, in the next slide, you see there's Bush visiting in March of '85, the Sudan, and they take him around different refugee camps. That's Numeri with the white shmata on his head on the right side, upper right hand side. And this is going to be obviously away from publicity. In public, the trip of George Bush to Sudan is about aid to Sudan, which Numeri desperately needs. I mean, besides his own political problems, they have like 1 million refugees and the country can't afford them, and America is going to supply, money and food and things like that. Behind closed doors, Bush, who was an excellent interlocutor with foreign leaders, that was one of his strengths. He had his weaknesses, but he had strengths, and one of them was he very good talking with foreign leaders. And basically, George Bush, when nobody's looking, said like this: listen, can you help me with the Jews? Can you help me with the Jews? Now, Numeri said, I can't stand this PR. And these Jewish blabbermouths, big mouths, This is going to bury me. I'm an Arab leader. I'm a head of an Arab country. I can't do this. George Bush says, I myself will handle it personally. I'll take it away from public view, and we'll solve this. And then Mary said, I guess, look, if you could do it quick and quiet, do it. I'll give you the green light. But, no publicity. George Bush returns to Washington, puts together a meeting between the CIA, the Pentagon, and the Mossad, right? And they go in action. The Mossad gets its Ethiopian Jews. By now, you had these Freddie Aklum and these other guys who had gotten out and made it to Israel, now work for the Mossad to get other people out. It's a little bit like used to be in the 30s when they had the Aliyah Bet and they tried to get these people into Palestine in the time of Hitler. That activists who would go back and try to get refugees out. So they return to Sudan. They head for the sprawling refugee camps near the Ethiopian border. Only these guys who are Ethiopian, they're Mossad agents, but they're Ethiopians. Only they can identify the Jews among the million refugees. Pick out the needles in the haystack. They do locate them, and they plan the logistics of getting them out of the camps and onto trucks. The CIA arranges with Mary that the mighty U.S. Air Force, headquartered in West Germany, will fly a bunch of these big Hercules Gigundo planes to the desert right near the refugee camps. No, it's not hundreds of miles away in Khartoum and all that. Too much PR. They're going to land them, like in a movie, right near the refugee camps, which is how they should have done things like Adkhila. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see that there's George Bush visiting, Sudan, talking about aid, but we can skip that. Let's go to the next one. Keep going. Here you go. El Gadaref is where the refugee camps are. Hundreds of miles away is the capital city. No! The U.S. is going to land planes right there in the desert. And so basically, we're going to round up these remaining refugees, get them on trucks, drive them a few miles away, get them on these gigantic American planes, and get everybody out of here, get them all the heck over with. So this won't last a long time. We'll do it in a day, we'll do it in 2 days, whatever, and come on to it. And then Mary doesn't have to worry about it, nobody else has to worry about it. This is what they should have done 10 years earlier, 5 years earlier. Just land the doggone planes over there, get them out, but it didn't happen that way, did it? And so, about 5 or 10 of these big, giant American planes will land, they'll pick everybody up, and everybody all want it that way. All this comes together the week before Pesach in 1985. Everything goes according to plan. So the planes landed there, it was coordinated, the refugees are brought there. There just turns out to be one big exception, which confirms what Karl Marx said, that what appears originally as tragedy reappears as farce. It turns out there are hardly any Jews left in the camps. Everyone thought, actually they guesstimated, that there were thousands of Jews left behind, at least 5,000 or something like that. And so the logistics of all these Hercules planes were calculated along the lines that we're going to talk about taking several thousand people out. So you need so and so many planes and so many times for the airlift and all the rest of it. But in the end, after combing all the camps, it's about 500. As it turns out that before the original operation was shut down that I spoke about before, not 90% had been taken out, something like 99% had been taken out. Okay? And in the end, 494 Ethiopian Jews are found in the camps and taken out and flown away. So this is anticlimactic. This would not be a good movie. Most of the American big planes land and then are immediately told, just go back, turn around, go back. Fragnish Kashes. You understand? So it's kind of a farcical end, but this can be called Operation Joshua by the PR flats, because if the first one's Operation Moses, so who's the successor of Moses? Is Joshua. The refugees are flown, not to Israel, they're flown to Germany, as was promised to Mary, so you can say, listen, they didn't fly to Israel, and obviously, once they land in the American Air Force Base in Germany, then a minute later they fly off to Israel, and they land in Air Force Base in Israel, where there's a big PR reception headed by Shimon Peres and the whole media. Shimon Peres praises Bush correctly to the skies. Let's go to the next one. This was a good deed on the part of George Bush, so I won't take it away from him, okay? I was never a fan of George Bush Sr., but what he did right, and this is one of them. I'll say also, to his credit, Shimon Peres also praised Menachem Begin in a public speech. Here's the irony. Menachem Begin was deep in depression in his apartment, in his pajamas, that we talked about last year. Begin had a mental crash, an emotional crash. And so it's very sad, because a few miles away, the Ethiopians are landing, and they wanted to thank him. Because the fact of the matter is, Begin is the one who reversed the racism. That's a fact. You understand? And he was out of it. You understand? So even though they thanked him publicly, it'd be an interesting movie, wouldn't it? You know, he wasn't holding by that, as we would say here. As a result, after this operation, which took place in Pesach, or the week before Pesach, late March, in 1985, Sudan was empty of all Jews. There's no more Mossad operations there. There aren't any Jews. And the other Jews are not able, after this, to escape over the border into Sudan. They're stuck in Ethiopia. So this brings the story of what happens to the Ethiopian Jews in the 1980s in terms of how many get to Israel over. There will be no more opportunities for these Ethiopian Jews, the bulk of whom are stuck back in Ethiopia, for the next 5 years. So they're going to have to endure all the junk of the Ethiopian civil wars. And if you, by the way, follow the news lately, I'm sorry to say this, nothing has changed. And I read the paper yesterday on the internet. There's a major war raging in Ethiopia today, and some Jewish guy got killed there, and it's a war between Group A and Group B, the Tigray army versus the National Ethiopian Army. I mean, I could be saying this in the 1980s. Sadly, this is what happens in certain parts of the third world. The violence does not end. Okay? The violence does not end. Now, I'm not going to devote any more time to this. Maybe next year, Mr. Hashem will return to the subject. And now I will turn to my topic of tonight, the state of Israel in the second Reagan administration, which equals the years 1985 to 89. Indeed, let us tonight consider the subject in general of Ronald Reagan and Israel. A question particularly interesting to us tonight, as the USA now transitions from Donald Trump, who was the most pro-Israel president, to the Biden administration, which is, as we speak, and we see in the next slide, the subject of much guessing, fearing, and hoping. All right? We do not know which way Biden and Kamala Harris will go. We hope that it'll be in a positive direction as far as Israel is concerned, obviously, but you're a little nervous. Overall, we begin with a fundamental sympathy for Israel on the part of Ronald Reagan, which is interesting, as Ronald Reagan did not come from a part of the country with any Jews. As far as I know, he didn't know any Jews growing up. He was some little town in Illinois that he grew up, a small town boy, and all the rest of it. And so it's not like, he had friends who were Jewish when he was young. On the other hand, as he grew up, I think this is the story of Ronald Reagan, he got into the movies. And so, remember, this was the Depression. So when he was able to get a job in Hollywood, and his agent got him $200 a week, that was a gundo back then, you understand? He was in clover. And therefore he made his career, I think as everyone knows, living in Hollywood in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. Okay? In those years, he encountered Jews. Hollywood, the studios were owned by Jews. In those years, I might point out, the actors were owned by the studios. That was the system at that time. Okay? You're under contract to the studios. The movie business was, as they would say, Jew heavy. And, the lawyers, the producers, the directors, and so forth. And most relevant to us, politics in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s particularly were dominated by two movements. Let's go to the next slide. This is just interesting. If you lived in Hollywood, Hollywood was very political, but in an unusual way. On the left of the spectrum, the question is how far to the left? The two possibilities were you were a New Deal Democrat or you were a communist. Okay? These are the two gods. You either embrace the God on the left or the God on the right. That's pretty well known. And this is the environment in which Ronald Reagan grew up and married and prospered and made a living. What I'm trying to say is, when you're finished acting for the day and you go tonight to a reception, to a party, to a meeting, to this, you socialize with people, the politics was either New Deal, either you were a Democratic liberal, as we'd say today, a follower of President Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan was a big fan of FDR. I know later on he switched to Republican, I get that. But I'm talking about in the first half of his life. He was a big Democratic liberal, as the term was defined back in those years. And other people who disagreed with him, they were communists, okay? Hollywood was a bastion of communist members, writers, sympathizers, people all over the industry. Now, this is just interesting in terms of the mental formation in politics of somebody like Ronald Reagan. Reagan himself was an FDR Democrat, and he remained an FDR Democrat under Truman. If I wanted to bother you, I could show you a clip in which he makes a speech in the '48 election against Dewey, saying everybody's got to vote Democratic this year. Hubert Humphrey came out for civil rights for the Negroes, he says. We got to make the good fight to keep America Democratic liberal. But Ronald Reagan was anti-communist. He wasn't the Synthetic group. Now, in those days, liberal Democrats opposed anti-Semitism and fascism. That's what it meant to be a liberal Democrat. After the war, they came to oppose communism too. Now, Ronald Reagan did not serve overseas during the war. He was an actor. I mean, he did stuff for the army, but he wasn't a soldier. Nevertheless, Reagan was not unaffected by the Holocaust. I think this is very interesting. Take a look. This is a quote from George Shultz's book, the Secretary of State. And let's read this. During the latter part of World War II, Reagan's job involved viewing film shot by the military cameramen and war correspondent photographers. Reagan assembled the selected shots into briefing films for senior officers. When he saw the first footage of the horror inside the concentration camps, in other words, in 1945, when the American Army liberated Dachau and these other places, filmed at the time the death camps were liberated, Reagan was immensely shocked. Against regulations, Reagan kept copies of the films because he said the scenes were so appalling that some people would later deny that it could have been so bad or that it had taken place at all. Now, this is George Shultz telling about Ronald Reagan, okay? How right he was. Isn't Holocaust denial today such a big factor out there? Now, 4 years after the war, Reagan recounted a guest at his house for dinner said he found the stories impossible to believe it couldn't have happened that way. Isn't that amazing? Right after World War II, people are already in denial. And by the way, this person, the guest, was not a bad person, just like a regular American. Said, I cannot believe it. What you really mean when you say I cannot believe it is what you mean is like this. I don't find it comfortable to believe it. Okay? This is just an interesting phenomenon. I know people like that. I don't want to believe it. Okay? Now, it couldn't have happened that way. So Ronald Reagan took out the can of film and he ran it for a skeptical guest. When Prime Minister Shamir made his first visit to Washington during the Reagan administration, the president told this story to Shamir, who was deeply moved by it. Upon his return to Israel, Yitzhak Shamir told the story to Israeli journalists who reported on it in the Hebrew language press. English translations were picked up by American reporters. As the story emerged in American newspapers, it became garbled, maintaining that Reagan had said he was present at the liberation of the camps as part of a U.S. Army film crew, which of course was not true. The president had said no such things, but the critics had cited as an example of Reagan's inability to distinguish fact from fantasy or real life from an actor's role he had played or wished he had played. But I, George Shultz, heard the true version. I knew the president back then had in his own way created his own Holocaust memorial. Now, if there's any truth to that story whatsoever, you see Ronald Reagan, like Truman, was powerfully impacted by the Holocaust. I think that's a very interesting story. Now, Reagan, as president, interpreted the Holocaust as demonstrating the need for a Jewish state. And I think that's the most important part. Here I'm going to show you a clip from a speech Reagan gave, I think it was during his first administration, to a gathering of Holocaust survivors. If you're old enough to remember this, my mother went. They had a thing in the 80s, in which all the people who were survivors were asked to come to D.C. and have some kind of big convention. It was by the U.S. Holocaust Council. And I remember my mother stayed there for a couple of days at someone's house in Silver Spring, I think, if I remember correctly. And maybe your mother did too. Maybe you might be somebody watching this, you yourself or your relative did so. And they had some big jamboree. And among other things, Reagan came to make a speech. Now, I'm not going to give a whole speech, a long speech. But I want to share the piece of the speech in which he says that I understand the meaning of the Holocaust. The lesson of the Holocaust is you need a safe Israel. Watch this.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan.
Today, you bear witness to a modern-day exodus from the darkness of unspeakable horror to the light and refuge of safe heavens. The two most important being America and what soon became the State of Israel. As a man whose heart is with you, and as president of a people you are now so much a part of, I promise you that the security of your safe haven here and in Israel will never be compromised.
So that's important. In other words, it's important to remember the Holocaust. It's more important to say it like this. Because of that, we've got to help Israel, because that's here now. But pretty soon, so in other words, coming after Jimmy Carter, Reagan seemed more sympathetic, especially to Menachem Begin. But pretty soon, strong differences emerged, as they had to. Many people don't understand this. You see, the foreign policies of the two countries were not, are not, and cannot be identical. Israel's a small country, and small countries, especially fragile ones, have to focus on their own needs exclusively. They have no margin for error. To a country like Israel, and most countries around the world, pursue a foreign policy totally with regard only to their own selfish needs, because they have to. You got to do it. And so Israel is always looking, how can I help Israel, not how can I help other countries. That's why Menachem Begin, for example, opposed the AWACS. Remember, during Reagan's first administration, I talked about it last year. Let's go to the next slide. Reagan said, I got to sell the AWACS to Saudi Arabia. We need it for American security and to keep Saudi Arabia as an ally of America in the Cold War. And Begin said, I don't care if the AWACS is beneficial to the U.S. It's bad for Israel. So there you have it. You understand? Reagan says, I need this for America. Begin says, I don't care. I have to go fight Israel. Each leader was doing the right thing. Each one was following his country's interests. By the way, that's why Bibi opposed Obama's Iran deal, right? He says, it's bad for Israel. It's going to result in Iran getting a bomb, then going to bomb Israel, okay? Now, in the case of Bibi, he also argued that it was against America's national interest. That's his speech in Congress. But basically, you have a clash between two policies, okay? Large superpowers cannot think of their own needs exclusively. The needs of setting up coalitions, securing alliances, managing clients, etc., requires a policy of what we call enlightened self-interest. So let's go to the next slide. That means you are mavater on things. You give up certain things. You make certain sacrifices for your broader general interests. We glory in America that after World War II, the U.S. gave about $20 billion approximately to Europe and Japan, who we had fought. okay, because of the Cold War. Now, wait a minute. You're taking a fortune from American taxpayers. $20 billion, okay? But what did Truman say? What did Marshall say? He said, it's necessary for the grant. We need a Europe. We need a Japan. They'll be on our side of the Cold War. So I'm trying to, it's simply an example of the fact that a large power, a superpower, has to think in grander terms, strategic terms, rather than what's in our own little national self-interest. By the way, this was Trump's argument against, all of his predecessors. And that's why Trump was criticized. By the way, it's not only America. Let's go to the next one. The USSR, which didn't have the money, gave billions that they couldn't afford to CASTRO. Oh, it's not the only reason Russia went under, of course, but one of the reasons is they spent so much money propping up guys like Castro, getting billions and billions because he said we need a base in the Caribbean for the Cold War. In terms of the Middle East, there is an existential tension between the broad needs of a superpower like the USA and the narrow needs of a tiny nation like the State of Israel. The latter, Israel understandably wants American policy to benefit Israel to the exclusion of all others. In other words, not to the exclusion of all others, but comes first. And if necessary, all other interests which hurt Israel should be sacrificed. America, by contrast, defines its interest in the Middle East more widely. It has to. And so if you look at the next slide over here, okay, you see there's Reagan with the king of Saudi Arabia, and what's he saying? He says, listen, the U.S. has wide interest in the Middle East, and not just Israel. This is why Ronald Reagan fought Israel on the AWACS, okay? This is why Donald Trump is selling these F-35s to UAE, the Arabs, and, let's go to the next one. You can't say Trump is an enemy of Israel, all the rest, but it can't be totally at the expense of the Arabs. He said, I got to help these guys out also. And Israel's uncomfortable with this, and what do you do? What do you do? That's why Reagan sanctioned Israel after Begin bombed the reactor in Baghdad, okay? That is why Reagan, though he backed Begin and Sharon, he supported the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, turned and strongly criticized Israel when Israel started bombing heavily Beirut in 1982. In all these cases, Ronald Reagan argued he's a good friend of Israel, but that did not mean that he signed off on anything Israel did, particularly when Israel's actions were not coordinated with the U.S. And let's take the next one. This is notorious now. We talked about it last year. Sharon failed to coordinate his invasion of Lebanon with America. He came and told in general terms, he said, we're only going to go a couple miles. He also failed to coordinate with Begin. And this is a problem. And as a result, it blew up in his face. Okay? Now, Sharon was a soldier, a good one too. And the main element of a good soldier, you learn from mistakes. Okay? You learn from mistakes. Now you learn the hard way, but you learn from mistakes. And it's just interesting to me that although Ariel Sharon in 1982 thought he can, bulldoze over America and the cabinet and everybody else, and of course it didn't happen and it turned out to be a disaster, he learned a lesson. And let's go to the next slide. When Sharon, 20 years later, became Prime Minister of Israel, he totally coordinated everything with George Bush Jr. I remember this. And you probably do as well. And so he was in Washington all the time. And because everything you want to do, you got to get America's green light. So even a guy like Sharon, let's put it this way, learn. I would say in general, by the way, after the Lebanon War of 1982, the necessity of te'um, of coordination with America, became hardwired in the consciousness of Israeli political leaders. And ever since then, I don't know if you noticed it or not, with rare exceptions, Israel has made any moves without clearing with Washington first, which down to the T. It's kind of interesting, okay? And on those occasions when there was a lack of this, let's go to the next one. When there's a lack of coordination, it was a crisis in relations. We'll see Mir Hashem next year when Shamir was the Prime Minister and George Bush Sr. was the President, and Shamir just unilaterally set up these settlements and things like that. It led to a crisis in relations between the United States and Israel. And it hurt both Shamir and George Bush. Okay? Actually, let's go to the next one. We all remember, doesn't the body language tell you everything over there? Right? It was a crisis in relations because there was not a coordination between Bibi and Obama, simply because they strongly disagreed. You understand? They could not come to agreement. Obama kept saying, just follow what I'm doing. Just follow what I'm doing. And Bibi said, you're doing the wrong thing. It's going to hurt Israel. And so, you see, as I said before, they're looking away from each other. Now, we are all scared of this, as I said a few minutes ago, because we have a new administration coming in with Biden. It's not a question of Democrats or both. We just don't know where the new administration will go. Let's go to the next one. We don't know what the future is. I mean, right now in America, everybody's asking the question, well, who will be the Secretary of State and all that sort of thing. And most relevantly, will the Iran deal be revived? So America will start giving them money again and supporting their quote-unquote peaceful development of nuclear energy and all that sort of thing. And Israel's scared in their pants, right? Scared in their pants. Now, does this crimp Israel's freedom of action? Yeah, of course. But it's the price you pay for superpower protection. On the other hand, can you rely on superpower protection? Let's go to the next one. History shows countries who rely on superpower protection, like Czechoslovakia in the 1930s, get hurt, okay? Get sold down the river. And so, it's tricky, it's complicated. A country like Israel wants maximum coordination with a superpower, but on the other hand, not total coordination, because sometimes our interests diverge. That is the story of Bibi and Obama. It's as simple as that. That's the story of Bibi and Obama. Now, last 4 years, Israel had a vacation. With Donald Trump, coordination has been easier. Let's go to the next one. If you read the papers, and I know you do, you won't be listening to me if you weren't the type to follow the news. They just released news, secret coordination behind the scenes, that they just shot mustard together with salami. America and Israel cooperated secretly to kill this General Salami, whatever his name was, and now this guy Mustard or something like that. And it was a joint CIA and Mossad operation. That's what they're saying in the papers. And what does that tell you? That's called maximum coordination. You understand? Now, that's under Trump. I don't know. I doubt very strongly in the Biden administration if we're going to have cooperation to take out, to kill, enemy leaders, something like that. That doesn't sound like the type of thing that a non-Trump administration would do. My point in all this is that Israel's relations with Reagan during his administration was generally good, but was fraught with bumps on the road due to the problem of the lack of real coordination on the part of the Likud governments of Begin and Shamir with Washington. I mean, look, there's no way that Begin could have coordinated the bombing of the nuclear reactor in Baghdad with Ronald Reagan. The Americans would never have approved. Right, let's go to the next one. Remember the Secretary of Defense, Castro Weinberger? He wanted to go, as it is, he blew a gut. And he wanted to punish Israel severely. Reagan only punished Israel mildly. But he went. I mean, you couldn't plan that beforehand, you see? So that would be Begin saying like this, listen, we can't coordinate everything with Israel. Israel's got to take it for itself. The world doesn't see this as a danger. We see this as a mortal danger. We got to act the way we see it. I get that. But then, there'll be a bump in the road with Washington. Now, Menachem Begin would say like this, so it's a bump. It's a bump. During the second Reagan administration, when Shimon Peres was the prime minister, Peres made it a hallmark of his policy to sort of pursue a policy of very close coordination. As a result, bilateral relations between Washington and Israel were strong and rather problem-free during the years of 85 to 89. When we get later on to talk about Pollard, which I'm not going to do today, it happened at, let me put it this way, at the best possible time. There's no good time for something like that to happen. But if it's going to happen any time, the best time was the second Reagan administration, because relations with Israel and America were very good. There was, however, one big exception, a very complicated exception, and I'm talking, of course, about the Palestinians, specifically the occupied territories. If we see in the next slide, which is the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. Remember that? Okay? So there's Israel, and then there's the territory that they took over in 67 war. But by the way, as an aside, as far as I'm concerned, the most remarkable thing that Trump did was not move the embassy to Jerusalem, but rather, I don't know if you know this, he officially recognized the Golan as being annexed and part of Israel. I don't know how you can do that. I'm not an international lawyer. And that's the thing really to watch what the next administration will do. I don't know what Joe Biden will do as far as the embassy is concerned. He may retain it, he may move an embassy to the airport. You know, those are more symbolic. But, and I'm not knocking the importance of symbolism. But the Golan Heights is vital interest to Israel. I don't have to tell you, you know that. And it's almost inconceivable to me that any administration that's not Trump would recognize that Israel has the right to keep territory they conquered from Syria in the 67 war. So that's just an interesting, keep that in mind. But I want to focus tonight, as I said before, on 40 years ago, 35 years ago, and the problem here was as follows. The USA, ever since Truman, has been committed to an Arab state of some kind in the territories, whether a Palestinian state or a Jordanian state or whatever. In other words, the USA has formally been opposed since 1948 to Jewish rule over the Palestinians and Palestinian rule over the Jews. This was the essence of partition. Okay? So we go to the next slide. We will recall the famous map of the UN in 1947, the partition map, in which the darker color is supposed to be Israel and the lighter color is supposed to be the Arab state. Right? There was supposed to be originally two states. That was what was called for in the 1947 partition resolution. There's a Jewish state and an Arab state. I know the lines are funny, but that's what they did. And even Donald Trump, who's been the most pro-Israel president, I'll say again, whether you want to admit it or not, is also in favor of a Palestinian state. Let's go to the next slide. Trump, as you see on the left, offered a truncated Palestinian state. Thus, he took away, if you look on the right and you compare with the left, closely you'll see that Trump's map gives a lot of the West Bank to Israel. So in other words, what he's saying is like this. You got to have a partition, and you got to have an Arab state there. I'm just trying to make it the best for you. I'm making it the smallest possible, and the Jewish part the biggest possible. But even Donald Trump, who's in Israel's corner, said, I guess you got to have some Arab state. And by the way, if you follow the news, and I know you do, the right wing in Israeli politics, the settlers and the others, were all very angry at the Trump plan, the Jared Kushner plan, even though he said, oh yes, listen, he gave him the best possible deal. No deal's good. Because any deal that would result in a Palestinian state to the people in the Shtachim, I'm talking about the Mitnachlim, the Jews in the settlements, is already poison. So you see what I mean when I say before, there's existential tension between the basic needs of a superpower like the United States on the one hand, and the Israelis, or at least the settlers in this case, on the other hand, and it's complicated. As I indicated in my first lecture last month, the question of Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank was and is an extremely divisive issue in Israeli body politic. Okay? Now, again, the right says it'll lead to another Hamas. It'll lead to another Gaza Strip. That's all we need. And the left said, no, it won't. Now, assuming that you favor an Israeli withdrawal, what should take its place in the West Bank? If you're talking back in the 1980s until today, Jimmy Carter always said like this, it's the PLO. Look, here's a picture, next slide. It's Jimmy Carter butting up with Arafat on the left, okay? And look at the next line, right? Let's go to the next one. There he's kissing the head of Hamas. And it's not that Jimmy Carter is doing this, because he hates Israel. That's a complicated question. I don't think he hates Israel. I think he's a kruma ashkafa, as we say. He just got the wrong idea. But his policy has always been, I just want to acknowledge reality. The reality is that these guys control, and they have the control of the population in that part of the world. And so anything you're going to have in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip is going to be the PLO or Hamas or somebody like that, and Israel should just get used to it. In the 1980s, which is what I'm talking about, this is not where Ronald Reagan and George Shultz were holding. To Reagan, Arafat was, first of all, a terrorist whose word was worthless. So a PLO state would be a terrorist haven, as if there weren't enough of those already. There were plenty of terrorist states already by the 1980s, these failed states and so forth, which were providing aid and comfort for international terrorism. So Reagan would agree with Israel. I don't want an Arafat state in the West Bank because we have cancer. And B, Reagan also was convinced that Arafat is a Soviet agent, mamish. So a PLO state will be a communist country. And there are too many of those also. So if you go to the next slide, to Reagan, and this was good for Israel at the time, Arafat is just another Castro. The U.S. made a terrible mistake in letting Castro come to power in Cuba in the late 50s. And ever since then, it was a cancer. So we'll just make a similar mistake if you allow Arafat to take over in the West Bank. Okay? Now, by the way, no one foresaw. I mean, Reagan said, I guess, we got too many communist countries as it is. We don't need another communist country called Palestine. No one foresaw that in 5 years, most of the communist countries would no longer be communist countries. No one could see with the looking glass in 1985 what the world would look like in 1990. Okay? When the vast majority of communist governments, including Russia, including Eastern Europe, would cease to be communist. I might add that since the PLO charter still committed itself to ending the existence of the State of Israel, the Reagan administration, like the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations, maintained a formal policy of not negotiating with the PLO. So the USA would not pressure Israel under Reagan to negotiate with Arafat. So Arafat was locked out, which was excruciating them, caused them infinite anguish. Good. But if it's not Arafat, if it's not a state run by the PLO, then who will run the state? Because they'll say again, Reagan and every other president said, I guess, got to have some kind of Arab state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Well, the answer was King Hussein of Jordan. Why? Why did both Reagan and Shimon Peres think a West Bank, including East Jerusalem, occupied by the Jordanian army, would be good for Israel? Hear what I said? Would be good for Israel. Why? I want to focus on this tonight, at least make a start, and therefore we have to do a little bit of background, because I don't think people understand exactly the balance for the nature of the issue over here. Okay? Let's go to the next slide. The original Palestine, after World War I, the Balfour Declaration of Palestine, which was set up by the League of Nations and given to Great Britain, as many know, included this whole area over here, okay? And included what we call today all of Israel and all Jordan. So let's just pretend for a second that things remain that way. You might have a state of Israel that's that big, okay? I mean, I could play scenarios, there's no point. You could have a state of Israel which is much bigger than the current state of Israel, okay? Now, I mean, look at that. Israel would be bordering on Iraq, had that happened. Now, then, as we all kind of know, Great Britain changed its mind, and they broke off half, more than half, and gave it as an Arab state to Abdullah. No, they said, it's not going to be part of Palestine. We're going to separate, we changed our mind. We're going to take off half of this on the right-hand side, what we call Jordan today, and give it to Prince Abdullah. Let's go to the next slide. So, this is 1921. It's shortly after the First World War. England now had all these countries in the Middle East that it owned and had to organize. And along these lines, Winston Churchill, who was the colonial secretary at that time, so he was in charge of this, he went to the Middle East in a famous conference with all of his advisors and all the big shots, and Lawrence of Arabia and Gertrude Bell and all the others. And they said, okay, how should we organize the Middle East? And one of the things they did several things. One of the things they did is that, you know, this Balfour Declaration of Palestine, I mean, we got it through, and the League of Nations confirmed it, so we, England, own it. Question is, what's the best way of managing it? And in my opinion, Churchill said that we should give half of it, bigger half, to Prince Abdullah as a kingdom for himself. Now, I'll explain why later, but this was a big gift. I'm giving you a country. I'm giving you a country, okay? And not a small one either, because I like you. This is why, in the photo you see in front of you, Abdullah, who's the Arab guy standing next to the three people in the center of the picture, running from right to left, is Churchill, and then Sir Herbert Samuel, who was the first British High Commissioner in Palestine, Jewish guy, Orthodox too, by the way. And next to him is Prince Abdullah, wearing a British uniform and an Arab headdress. Why is Abdullah kissing up to Churchill? Well, you give me a country. You give me a country. Matter of fact, you want to see something cool? I'm going to show you two videos before you see them. At this reception over here is at the palace, that's not the right word, at the mansion of the High Commissioner, the British Governor General of Palestine. And Winston Churchill is visiting, so they have a reception. And you see the guests coming out of this door and going down the steps. Some of these scenes, all from 1921 when Winston Churchill is visiting the Palestine, and he was pro-Zionist. So Achim, the guy who was our friend, the pro-Zionist, took away most of the country, gave it to a prince. Let's go to the next one. See, there you see from a different angle everybody leaving the High Commissioner's palace. That's Sir Herbert Samuel at the top. Here's Rav Kook again. Okay, Sam is wearing a uniform. And here you see different rabbis. That's the Sephardic rabbi at that time from Jerusalem. And everybody's shaking hands. Okay, and he's helping him go down there. There's the old rabbi. There's somebody from Meah Sharm. I don't know who that is. There's the Arab guy, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, as they call him later on. And here you see a big reception in Yerushalayim for Churchill, okay? And you see the different kinds of groups over there. And there's the guy in the white uniform with the white hat, and that's Sir Herbert Samuel. And he's shaking hands with all the different religious leaders. Because you're British, you want to kiss up to the Christians and to the Jews. There's the Rabbanim sitting over there smoking their cigarettes, okay? That's Jungreis and the famous people. And here we have Churchill visiting a Jewish settlement, okay? And you see he can't make up his mind whether to take his hat off or on because he's in a Jewish place and he thinks in a Jewish place you have to keep your hat on. Okay, that's Winston Churchill, take your hat off and on, saying hello, and then put the hat back on. That's Sir Herbert Samuel. Behind them are all the big Zionist mockers, okay? That's Usishkin, and they have a big reception, and I think Rav Kook is there if I remember correctly. And now everybody's going to make a bunch of speeches. This is the Palestine of the British era, okay? And this is, I might even say, the best part, because Churchill came very early on, and he said England favors the Jews over here. He made a speech, and he said we hope to see 3 or 4 million Jews move here and set up a Jewish commonwealth or something along those lines, okay? And here's the chief rabbis of Israel. That's Rav Kook for the Ashkenaz, and Rav Yaakov Meir at that time. Well, for the Sephardim, the Rishon LeZion, as they used to call them over here, and everybody's making speeches because that's what you do when it's a Jewish gathering. You make speeches and speeches, okay? And each one has to be translated, and then Churchill gets up to make a speech, as you can see, or something like that. And he's got to listen, and everybody's going to have a boring time, I guess. I don't know. But no, they're very interested in what does the colonial secretary have to say. That's, what's his name? Nachum Sokolov, who was the leader of the Zionist Federation and a long speaker. And there's Churchill giving his speech with his hat on, okay? And a good time is had by all. See the British flags are flying everywhere. And then you'll see in a second the reception. I'll tell you again, he said, I'm very impressed with what I see. But, as they said before, this same Churchill is going to take away the majority of the land of the mandated territory of Palestine and give it to Prince Abdullah. There's that reception we saw before. Here's all the Galas. Here's the rabbi, the Sephardic, and then here's Rav Kook, as you see, who shakes hands with one but doesn't want to shake hands with the woman. And therefore he skipped Abdullah, and after him comes Chaim Sonnenfeld, and so on and so forth. Okay? So these are, I think it's rather cool, that's all. Now, I've taken you back to this era, to the 1920s, or 1921 to be exact. Why was Prince Abdullah given this? After all, he's from Mecca. He's not from Jordan. Abdullah was from Arabia. His father was the Sharif of the Hijaz. He's from Arabia. Let's go to the next slide. Prince Abdullah fought with Lawrence of Arabia. That is Lawrence of Arabia, and that's Lawrence of Arabia with Abdullah. He helped them fight in the First World War against the Turks. Now, the reason is very simple. England felt embarrassed. Let's go to the next slide. They had promised the Arabs, meaning they promised Abdullah's father, this. Look at that big kingdom. They said, if you help us fight the Turks, we will give you one big Arab kingdom. Look how big that kingdom is. It's equal today to one big kingdom, including Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the UAE, Bahrain, wait a minute, Israel, Syria, Iraq. You see how big this is? It's a gigundo business. And so basically they said if you help England against Turkey, you'll get this as a prize. But in the end, it didn't happen that way because they broke it up. Part they gave to France, part they gave to this, part they gave to that. And so they said like this, as consolation prize, let's give you Jordan. So this is disgusting. He took away half of our land just because they felt the consolation prize to a guy. All right? Only the British Empire in its heyday, with an actual surfeit of karka around the world and across the globe, could do such things. They did it for the Jews. Let's go to the next one. You remember back in 1903, 1904, the colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, said to Theodore Herzl, he said, I'd like to help the Zionists. I'm sure we can find you something. Here, Uganda. You know the story. They offered, I should say, to Theodore Herzl, you can have a Jewish state in Uganda in 1904. Okay? Now, how can you do that? Because England had so much territory that they could divvy up pieces of it. Nobody else is like that except the British Empire. Now, before you laugh, I always point out, had the Jews taken Uganda, or Kenya, which is more really what it is, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. There would have been a place for the Jews to go. So it's complicated. So the British, who wanted to observe the first rule of politics, Churchill, and the first rule of politics is reward your friends and punish your enemies. I repeat, reward your friends. And because they were unable to give Faisal, the brother of Abdullah, a big kingdom as they promised, they gave the two brothers, Faisal and Abdullah, two kingdoms. Okay? They created two countries for them. They created two countries. And let's go to the next one. Let's create two kingdoms for these guys. And so the country that you call today Jordan, the country that you call today Iraq, were simply created so Churchill could discharge what he felt was an obligation to these guys. The locals were not consulted, okay, including the Jews. So if we go to the next slide, you see that Churchill basically said, I'm sure you won't mind helping out the British Empire, because after all, the British Empire has been generous to you. They gave you the Balfour Declaration, so allow me to detach half of it for the Arabs, okay? Now, in the case of Faisal, when they created Iraq, they created an ethnic monstrosity, and that's why today there's huge wars being fought in Iraq all the time. The worst part of the whole thing was the Kurds got screwed, right? Because the Kurds are part of Iraq, and they didn't want to have anything with any of this, and Churchill just threw them into a country, because he said, we need to build up a piece of land to give Faisal a Medina, okay? Abdullah was more fortunate. He had a more homogeneous population. The country we call Jordan was almost empty, and it was only Bedouins. And Abdullah's kind of a Bedouin, sort of. And so it's a homogeneous business. But Abdullah always dreamed of achieving the great kingdom promised his family in the First World War. That map I showed you, the yellow map, in the eyes of King Abdullah, he always wanted that. He said, you know, I got Jordan now, that's temporary, but eventually I'll get big. It's funny, he never gave up this dream. He was so fixated on the dream that he even was prepared to incorporate Zionism into his plans if the Jews would only cooperate. Abdullah would grant them religious freedom and even autonomy in his future great kingdom. He couldn't understand. He was so selfish. He thought in his own terms. He couldn't understand why the Jews did not grasp his offer to them. Let's go to the next slide. It's well known that he met with Golda Meir just before the 48 war. And he said, Mrs. Myers, why don't you accept my proposal and be my subject? I'll be very nice to you. Okay? And in other words, it goes, and I'm not saying he meant it bad. I'm saying he meant it like all aristocrats. It's total selfish. Why can't you be part of my kingdom? This is why, my friends, Ben Gurion would never agree to meet with Abdullah, even though Abdullah wanted to meet them all the time. Let's go to the next slide. You know, he said to Golda Meir, "Vos built a Meshugana," you know. He said, we didn't build up Israel and sacrifice so much blood and treasure to be part of Abdullah's kingdom. You understand? Now the Palestinians across the river, in the West Bank, I'm talking about in Israel, were divided in their attitudes towards Abdullah. Some clan chiefs favored his rule because they're all cut from the same cloth. They're Arab aristocrats. Others, more sophisticated, opposed him. And it got more complicated. This is called Palestinian inner politics, because the leader of the opposition to Abdullah was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and his big family, the Husseinis. Okay? And so basically you end up in the 1920s and particularly the 30s with a gang war. Let's go to the next one, which they call the Intifada. The Intifada was against the British and the Jews. It was also a civil war. Okay? And the gunmen of these two mafia dons have a gang war and they shoot each other right and left all during the 1930s and into the 40s. I mean, they were assassinating each other in the middle of World War II. So look how, this is Ronald Reagan's Jordanian option. This is Shimon Peres' Jordanian option. Should I carry this story forward? I think I've spoken enough for tonight. So let's just leave it at that and pick up next week. And let's go to the last slide, when the Grand Mufti will be succeeded by Arafat, who was a relative of his. And Abdullah will be succeeded by his grandson, King Hussein. And then you'll see the dynamics of the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan and Shimon Peres, each with the good intentions, were trying to figure out what's the best way to dispose of the self-government of the Arab territories of Israel in a way that will be good for the Arabs and will also be good for Israel, if such a thing is possible. With that, I bid you good night.